Welcome to the Campground Catalyst Podcast, the show dedicated to fueling success in outdoor hospitality. Whether you're an outdoor adventurer, a campground owner, or looking to build your legacy in outdoor hospitality, you're right where you need to be. We're here to guide you through the fascinating world of campground management, unique real estate strategies, and the gratifying opportunities created by outdoor hospitality. Our mission is to inspire and equip you with the knowledge and insights you need to build a successful business and create a legacy worth leaving. The Campground Catalyst Podcast is proudly sponsored by Beyonder Camp, your trusted outdoor hospitality experts. Subscribe now, join our active online community, and let's ignite our passions and potential together.
Welcome back to the Campground Catalyst Podcast. I'm your co-host, Robert Earl. I'm here with Justin Hoggett, Adam Lundy, and Don Spafford. Gentlemen, how are we doing today?
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Good, Robert. Good to see you guys.
Got a great topic today. We're going to dive into a listener-submitted question in our Memory Maker section of our podcast. Has to do with your campground, what your mix should be. Now, I don't mean where you're serving at the Drunken Minnow as far as our cocktails. We're talking about our seasonals versus overnights versus cabins, your source of revenue that you would have for a campground, and what that mix should be. Should you have seasonals? Should you not have seasonals? I think one of the first things we need to do is define, what do we mean by seasonal? What do we mean by nightly? What do we mean by transient? Those types of things. So who wants to jump in and give a definition for one of those?
Well, I'll give you some of the, I guess, the definitions we use internally at Beyonder anyway when we're referring to this is transient, first off, is anybody who stays less than 30 days. You know, in some states, we actually have to define that as less than 29 days. You know, and the main reason for having this designation, and this is actually part of what really attracted us to this outdoor hospitality space to begin with, was the idea that if you had a problem person, you didn't have to evict them. You know, you could, if they hadn't established residency yet, they were considered a transient. They can leave any time. So if you had a problem, they were violating your rules, you could kick them out. So 1 to 29 days is typical, we say, around the country for transient.
Okay. And then, so what are we defining then as being a seasonal or monthly? Because those are terms that are thrown around.
Yeah, carry that forward. Monthly, just as it sounds, right? We have the monthly guest that pays every month on the first, kind of more like a tenant type of situation, but still on a 30-day agreement, so it can end pretty much any time. Seasonal, just that, where the season can be typically April 15 to October 31 of each year, and they pay for that season throughout, and it's a one-time, more or less lump sum, gets you the whole seasonal access with a limited visitation right to the property. So we get to see those people very regularly, pretty much weekend travelers, maybe people that live close by and come and enjoy the property.
Right. And I'd say there's in that mix as well, you know, typically what we would consider like RV park where people live there year round, where, you know, some of those like southern state areas, for example, they're not really many amenities, but it's more of a, almost like a mobile home park kind of situation, but for RVers to kind of plug in and live there year round.
Great point, Don. We're trying to change the terminology a little bit because we have always said we buy and run RV parks, but that terminology is a little antiquated in that, yes, an RV park is more of a park where people just long-term live, and that's not the area that we're in. We like to say RV campgrounds.
Tied into a park model or different types of units that are in there. In Florida, there's even some of those communities where you end up having the folks there long enough where they end up forming an HOA. Talk about convoluted, of having an HOA within an RV park that has different rules regarding those types of things. So what's the pluses and minuses of doing it? I know from an operator standpoint what I would say, but how about from the investment side as to whether or not we have seasonals versus overnights and transients, and from an ownership side? So what do you think, Don, from the investment side as to what you're looking for or how you consider that?
Yeah, a good way to look at that perspective is kind of going back to those definitions we were saying, those, you know, kind of like nightly versus monthly or seasonals is the amount of revenue that each of those can generate. typically those transient campers that are come and go, like say on a weekend, they're here for a few days and they go home. Those are typically going to create higher revenue. And I like to compare that when I talk to investors is like, think of like a short-term rental home versus a long-term rental home. Exact same house, same location, more or less we'll say. Typically that short-term rental, like an Airbnb type situation, is going to get higher revenues than your long-term renters in that same exact property. And so for us, kind of the same thing with these transient campers. They're paying more of a premium to stay there on a nightly basis versus, a seasonal camper or a year-round resident kind of thing. So from that side of perspective, it is much more profitable to have more of that transient base to create that higher revenue, to therefore get the higher returns back to investors.
Okay, so how about from the owner-operator standpoint as to that plus or minus or what mix you're looking for?
Yeah.
Well, how much work do you want to put into the property? I think is kind of what you're going for. I think there, long-term guests, less work. Transients, a lot check-ins and check-outs, more work, right? Kind of simple.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a little backstory on this too, because when Justin and I first got into this, we had this idea that, we told ourselves the story that campground owners who had seasonal campers were lazy. We said that, well, if they're just throwing in the towel and they're not wanting to do the marketing to bring in, transient campers. And here's what we looked at is, some of the campgrounds at the time, they were charging $2,000 to $3,000 a year for a seasonal site. That means no matter what, basically, especially if you're in a place that has winter where you're generally closed and not making income in that time, that one patch of dirt or patch of gravel or concrete or whatever it was is making $2,000 to $3,000 a year. But we knew on a transient model that same patch could make $8,000 a year, $10,000 a year, depending on how it was operated. So for us, it seemed like a no-brainer to try to maximize the number of transient campers in the campground. What we came to learn over time is that there's a balance. So there's no one right model all the way across the board. We've seen other people in our space, just give a nod back to the investor side, who actually prefer turning these campgrounds into seasonal campgrounds, because their investors feel more comfortable with steady income. It might not be as much income as is possible, but it's more steady because you get all those contracts signed at the beginning of the year and paid, and you know how much you made for the year versus, you have one bad weather storm, that comes through and it might shut your town down for July 4th weekend, and then, you might lose on, a lot of revenue for the year. So there's more risk that comes with the transient model, but there's a balance. And the question, of course, then becomes, how do you find that balance?
And the investor is going to look for that cash in hand. From an operational standpoint, definitely the overnight, I can see the investor side of it, the overnights that are checking in, checking out, they're going to pay a slight premium to be in that site. Staffing wise though, and what that camper is expecting, what that RVer is expecting is completely different than what the longer term guest is expecting. And you have to, if you have that blend, you really have to account for what am I trying to look for. I always kind of use the Good Sam checklist of getting that perfect score of 30. That's what that overnight camper is looking for, as much or as close to it as they possibly can, as comparison to, I don't say that they lessen their standards, but they're looking for a level of stability, and once they have that, then they're looking more towards the value of what they're getting. What is my monthly amount? How does that fit into other housing sources around the area? So we have to go into a mix to it. I guess I would piggyback on that as well, as to when you're talking about staffing, is just the overall management of the park. It takes a different, I won't say it takes a different individual, but there are different skill sets in dealing with longer term guests that are involved, that you see on an ongoing basis, that you see you're in a long-term relationship with these individuals. And if there happens to be a faucet dripping and it continues to drip and drip and drip in the bathrooms and you don't take care of it, you're going to hear from them. So how do you deal with that? How do you keep that type of environment versus the overnighter? If they see that it's dripping, you may not get a review or a feedback on it, but they'll tell you once. You don't hear about it over week after week as to what you're going through. It takes a different management style to deal with those different aspects of it and keep it positive over the course of the entire season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And going back to the previous comparison I did with the short-term rental, the Airbnb kind of same thing. if you're running a short-term rental, you're going for high reviews. You want people to give great reviews so people will be attracted to your property and come back there, right? So with that entails a high level of service. They expect everything to work perfectly, there'll be no problems, and if there's a problem, it's going to get fixed immediately. And kind of same kind of thing in this situation. You've got those people that are coming for a 4th of July weekend, like as we said here, and they expect certain things. They want those amenities there. They want everything working right. They don't want cold showers, I guess. And so so having those things to available and working properly, and the staff that can see to their needs, kind of almost like an immediate basis, is going to help I guess drive them to leave a positive review when their stay is finished and they're leaving.
Yep. On the seasonal side, I want to throw this in because, the question we got, of course, was how to create the right mix of seasonals and transients. And I don't know that we actually know the exact science behind how we get there, but typically the process we do is we look at, which sites got occupied the most the year before and which got occupied the least, and then we get an idea of the sites that maybe could be making more money as a seasonal site versus a transient site. You might have that one that's kind of back in the corner, and the people that are coming out for, their big vacation of the year, they don't want that one in particular, but the person who just wants their place to get away and see their friends every weekend might not mind it. So if it only made $2,000 last year and you can turn it around as a seasonal site for $4,000, that's a great opportunity. So that's one way we look at this, but the big consideration that I would encourage anybody getting into the seasonal business to make, especially if you're running transient and seasonal at the same time, is how you lay this out physically in your park. Because I think we learned this the hard way on our first campground that had a mix of the two. If you put the overnighters next to the seasonals, you've got two different cultures of people. You got people who want a quiet night, to sit by their fire with their loved ones, and then you got the rowdy seasonals who all know each other. They're all friends and they're having a great time. But they're being noisy and they're partying next door, and it's two different groups. So you might have to think about how you actually physically separate them in your campground when you're coming up with this balance.
Or vice versa, because it's the folks that are the seasonals and this is their quiet place, so they're retired or want to just have this as being their home, and then they start talking about stay off my lawn and don't walk your dogs in this particular area, where the weekender's just coming out to blow off some steam, to have a couple cold ones, to play a little bit of music and enjoy the amenities with the golf carts or riding their bikes with the kids. And we heard about that at Ojai, or the conferences we go to, as to how do you handle a situation where the kids are riding all over the bikes and doing things, and you have somebody saying stay off my lawn. That becomes a cultural situation right there. And now as a manager, you've got to deal with that. It's nice to get that revenue to come in, but you have to deal with that situation.
You turn from manager to mayor pretty quick.
Very quickly.
Yep.
Yeah, and to the mix of sites a little bit more, you've got the pull-through sites and the back-end sites as well. Like I wish there was an easy answer to this question. Again, I don't think there is a specific formula that we could really follow, but we have the full pull-through sites that are more transient focused, right? It allows people in and out quicker. Some of the back end sites might be more advantageous for the seasonal / monthlies. And then to add to the mix is the monthlies. So we're really kind of talking about three different opportunities here, because the monthlies, yes, they live there longer. They're going to be a little bit harder on your systems. The sewage, you got to pay attention to their lines, especially in the winter. Are they getting heated correctly? I mean, there's a lot of different things with the long-term monthlies, but those people are kind of can be a lifeblood of the property, especially during some of the off-peak times that aren't as popular and seasonal type, or well, I shouldn't say seasonal, but the prime season of the year. And then when we lay those out, we consider the demand kind of, yes, you can make more money on some sites that might be closest to the pool, might be closest to the lake, or other amenities that are important and high demand. Those can usually get higher rates on the transient side, so you might not put your monthly and seasonal people there. So on our maps, we generally will look at the outside of the property or in the inside of circles to put a congregated section as more of the longer term peoples, because we know that they're more or less, you're going to have a higher rental rates on the on the perimeters, on the pull-throughs, and the amenity-focused sites.
Your systems are very important with this as well, because you're not just talking about an ADR now, you're talking about an SADR, your site average daily rate, and what each site is bringing in, and do you have the ability to track it? And then another important factor to this is agreements. Do you have the right type of agreement in place that lets them know what their rights are? They're even if they're in a monthly and seasonal standpoint, they're in a facility where they're not tenants. So it changes the language that you have in your agreement. It changes the language of what you're doing with the individuals. They're not renting. They are visitors. They are guests from that standpoint. If they are not in their agreement, you pay, you stay. You don't, you won't. But if you haven't put that into the agreement that they're signing, then you're going to have a difficulty. I think one of the tools that we use, though, to decide which sites are on, it's just like this with the Rubik's Cube, right? There it is right there, as to it's more factors involved with it than just the one thing that you're considering. And do you have the systems and people in place to support whatever your decision is?
Robert, I want to touch on the legal agreements real quick, because that's an area near and dear to me, is, just making sure that we're putting ourselves in the best position as campground owners and managers, for how we bring people in, do this the right way, and make sure that if they're a problem, we don't have to go through an eviction. That's our goal. That's part of what got us into that outdoor hospitality space, is not wanting to evict people. But there are ways to do it wrong, and unfortunately, you can find yourself in a position where someone becomes a tenant. So you really have to obviously consult with your attorneys. We are not giving legal advice here today. It's going to be worth it for you to pay your attorneys a couple $1,000s that it might cost to consult and write all these agreements out for you and get them the way that they need to be in accordance with your local state laws, because I can't give advice. Every state's a little different. Like I mentioned before, we have states that actually define anything beyond 29 days as residency. Other states, it's 30 days. So if you write a 30-day agreement in a state that's got a 29-day law, well, guess what? You've got a tenant, and now you've got somebody that you actually have to evict. So that's a problem. When we talk about the transient, again, of course, that's you figure that person could potentially be there 24/7 for that entire period. So if they were to stay unusually long, they could easily claim it's their residency. And there are things that people can do that can actually, in less than 30 days, create constructive residency, meaning, there are little factors that the court might evaluate. Like if you let them get mail on site. I'll tell you this, if you have mailboxes on site and you're doing this out of convenience for your guests, unless you're okay with them being there and you like them all and you don't ever want them to leave, I'd strongly consider getting rid of it, because that is one of the things that's considered in constructive residency, is having mail on site. Letting people send mail to you, even if you don't have mailboxes, they collect mail at the store for them, putting their address on their driver's license. It should be in your agreements. They're not allowed to use that as their physical address. That's a big consideration. And of course, this is not usually going to be the case with the transients, but where it really comes into play is those monthlies and seasonals. In our case, the agreements we have, Justin mentioned at the beginning, is seasonals are allowed to stay a certain number of days per month. And the reason we do this is because these agreements are written beyond 30 days. So this is an agreement that spans, 4 to 6 months on some of our campgrounds. So what we do is we actually have to define in the agreement that they don't live there. And in fact, they have to be off site for so many days every month. I believe our rule is 14 days a month. There is the maximum they're allowed to be on site on the property. They can come out on the weekends, take a long week in the middle of it, whatever the case is, but the other times they have to be gone, their car's gone. So there's some certain ways you got to work with it. The monthlies get a little trickier. Monthlies, I think, is the biggest risk for us in this space if you don't have the right agreement to have someone, become a tenant.
And then it's a collection standpoint on a monthly basis, as well as to the amount that they're paying for the site, and then the amount that they're paying for any other services that you also really can't have that type of agreement on terms, that it's a payment beforehand, and then any other services, electric, pump out, those types of things have to be collected immediately, and you spell out what those things are. The other aspect that's included in those agreements has to be the use of amenities, as to what they're doing from the amenities and what availability. I'm not saying that the seasonals can't come over and use the bathhouse, etc. Yet I had a park that I was a work camper at where there was a row of 4 or 5 units where I know none of their plumbing worked in the actual unit. So they were putting a drain on your bathhouses, And although we were seasonal, the cleaning that had to be done, the housekeeping and cleaning that had to be done on the restroom facilities so that they were ready for your overnights, put a undue strain on the park from that standpoint, because their units were not in the right working condition.
So, going back to, I guess, the question, right, for this, the right mix. I think, at least in my opinion, maybe you guys give your thoughts on this. Some of that also may due to the location. If your campground is near some kind of a major natural attraction anyway, right? Like people are flocking to like millions every year. It may make more sense to have almost a purely transient type of campground, knowing that you're going to be packed with people that are coming to that tourist attraction anyway. Versus if you're kind of in the middle of nowhere, you'll probably be better on the higher seasonal count. Do you guys feel the same about that?
I would say, yeah, most people don't open their campground with the intent of opening a seasonal campground. I think it's a progression people make to find ways to maximize their revenue over time as they, learn where the deficiencies are in their, either their size or their scalability.
And in most places, the seasonal can help with cash flow. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, for example, you can start collecting seasonal fees in December, January, February, when you're not typically collecting any money at all. So it can help level that cash flow line for you. It's not realized income necessarily when you take seasonal income, but taking that cash flow in, helping pay the mortgage, so that can become a consideration for people as well.
Yeah, don't go bet all those seasonal dues on red, because if the campground burns down, you're going to be giving them back.
Definitely.
I'll give a counterpoint to what you were saying though there, Adam. We're seeing a couple questions come through our Patreon channel. A little plug there. Make sure that you subscribe, because we're going to be answering questions through there. Some of them are individuals that are looking to build the campground that are strictly in a seasonal standpoint. Really what they're building is mobile home parks that happen to have RVs in them. Because they don't want to do the labor, because they don't want to be there on the weekends, and they don't want to do that standpoint. They're trying to look at it as a passive form of income or a side hustle by designating the space this way. And because they don't have the right structure in place, they could get themselves into a lot of trouble as to evictions, the condition of the park, upkeep, all of those types of things.
No, you're right, and there's a fair point too about the seasonals and some of them being built that way. Of course, in Florida, for example, there are a lot that are purpose built to be more seasonal because they're attacking a certain market down there. But yeah, 100% agree. And I'm just going to go back to the point I said before. Lawyers are a necessary evil. Make sure you pay them to get these agreements, done right for you. Don't try to DIY this yourself. Your state laws can be very complex, and tenants are usually given special protections at the state level, in most states. So, you're going to be basically having to present your case against them. They're going to be given the benefit of the doubt every day of the week about whether or not they actually had tenancy and residency on your property. So that's just my 2 cents. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not representing any lawyers here. This is just something that it's absolutely worth paying for.
In some states more so than others, that's for sure.
I would say another good option to consider, obviously besides the necessary fees for a lawyer, but especially if you're going to do build a brand new campground, or plans to transition an existing campground to be more transient, would be the cost to do a feasibility study. Paying the experts, right, to have them run those calculations and figure out the right mix of everything you want to need, besides have so many transient, so many seasonal, so many cabins or glamping options that may be to consider as well. Those feasibility studies, are obviously a good upfront expense. Probably expect to pay about $10,000 to $12,000 or maybe more. But it definitely could save you in the long run if you just assume you're going to do this whole thing how you plan, and it does not work out because you didn't know the proper mix to put in there.
You brought up
100% worth
cabins. Yeah, definitely to make that investment. You brought up cabins and glamping. How do those things factor into those types of accommodations? How do they factor into the monthly and seasonal? I know what my answer is, but I want to get a take from the folks around the table that are in that situation.
I think we can pretty quickly with glamping say that that's going to be your nightly, weekly. I don't know anybody who wants to stay in a canvas tent for more than a week.
I don't know. We got some pretty nice
homeless
cabins.
guys, maybe.
Yeah, well, hey, so you got some cabins. What about those aspects of it? What limits do you put in place for those?
I think they're
Yeah.
2 weeks, right? Yeah.
You're going by
So
our rules specifically, but as
yeah,
far as industry best practices,
yeah,
I
we're
see some campgrounds that are being built and that get advertised. They're on Woodall's or we see them posting there where they're saying this is 100% glamping or 100% cabin bases, and realize that what they're going towards then is a transient model, is an overnight model, and it better be close to a location where they're going to get that level of traffic in. I'm waiting to see the first one that ends up becoming a little bit more permanent, and becomes almost a tiny home community, or the transition of it. And I've seen a couple of those in North Carolina, Florida, where they've made the decision to forget it. We're not going to do RVs. We're not going to do this. We're just going to strictly become a tiny home community.
And I did just read an article, study that was done by one of the players in our field, and they were recognizing the need for more cabins and stays that are atypical to camping. And some of that could be just simply having a rental trailer as well on your property, but a lot of people are looking more towards an easier stay, not taking their own camper. Of course, campers are expensive for people to own for their own right anyway, but having something that's easy to stay, something that's a little bit more personalized, more amenity rich versus a hotel. So something you can pull up to easily. The cabins include oftentimes a small kitchen in those, what you're considering a park model / tiny home, very similar. And and having the mix of options too, because that's become very important. Having an RV site for those that do have their camper, having a cabin for those that don't, and maybe want to stay close to a loved one, or kind of back to the transient side of things, where if it's close to, in our Iowa property, one of them might be closer to the football venue of University of Iowa football. So having something that's easy for people to come and stay during events can be important too. So having also measurability, as you're saying, Robert, having something that says, okay, well, we're filling these, right? Like, is there, like, maybe don't start with 30, but start with 2. And how are they filling up? Do people appreciate them? Are they rating well? And then start gradually adding a few more, maybe, towards the 8-10 mark.
Yeah.
and to your
Do you have
question,
the
Robert, about
staffing in
this,
place? Do you have the staffing in place? Do you have the housekeeping in place? Can you track that type of information? And guess what? We just paid another lawyer because we created another agreement for a cabin as opposed to an RV site or a different type of stay.
yeah. Well, and to your point, real quick, Robert, or your question rather, on the cabins and glamping and the types of stays there. I would encourage anybody who's building a cabin property or putting more cabins in to consider the types of cabins you're doing based on the type of stay. If you're planning, because in our industry, a common term for cabins is, or a cabin is a common term for park models, and a park model is basically an RV, more or less, that's built like a cabin, but really they're built like an RV, and we know how RVs get built. And depending on the type of stay that's in there, it's really going to determine how much use and abuse that unit sees. And I'll say, just from our own experience, we've got a guest house on one of our properties that, when we've allowed people to stay longer than a week, you see a lot harder use on those units. They start treating it like their own house rather than, being a guest somewhere, and they're a little more rough on things, and things get broken and get soiled and go missing. So, really strong consideration. If you did want to have people in longer term in a cabin, I'd probably consider doing stick-built cabins.
So great topic today, talking about the mix of our seasonals, our overnights, cabins, glamping. I think we touched on a lot of things. If you've got a question regarding campgrounds, RV living, investing in campgrounds, we've got a Patreon channel that you can subscribe to, that you can be a part of. Also, you can follow along with this podcast. We're on all the major players. If you're seeing us on YouTube, smash that subscribe button. You'll get notified of new episodes that come out. Join our Patreon. Ask us a question. We're going to get to the point where we'll be answering the questions that are delivered in Patreon versus just out on the socials. So you want to be a part of that. Until next time, enjoy your campground trips.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Campground Catalyst Podcast, where we take you behind the scenes in the fun and gratifying world of outdoor hospitality. We hope you were inspired by today's show and better equipped to take the next steps in your journey. Remember, you can continue the conversation and connect with fellow enthusiasts by visiting our website and joining the Campground Catalyst community on Patreon at campgroundcatalyst.com. There, Patreon members get exclusive access to special listener perks, they get their opportunity to engage with the host, and they get their questions answered on one of our future upcoming shows. The Campground Catalyst Podcast is proudly sponsored by Beyonder Camp, your trusted partner in fueling your success in outdoor hospitality. Until next time, keep both your campfires and your passions burning.